Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Varun Krovi, and on behalf of all of my colleagues here at Invariant, I'm pleased to welcome you to our 10th Dialogue for Change. Dialogue for Change is Invariant's series focusing on critical conversations about racial injustice and inequality and the actions we can take to influence change in the public and private sectors. Through our series, we ask, what can lawmakers, CEOs, employees, and individuals do to enact change? Today's discussion examines an issue that is deeply personal for me, and that is how do we define and improve diversity, equity, and inclusion for the Asian American Pacific Islander community, also known as AAPIs. We are going to talk about the surge in hate incidents against the AAPI community, stereotypes about who we are, barriers to equality and opportunity, and public and private sector strategies for addressing these challenges. In many ways, today's event is a discussion of my own experience as an immigrant and as an Asian American. The American dream is an idea that in this country, anyone can succeed. It's a promise that draws immigrants to our shores. I've achieved my American dream. When I moved to this country 17 years ago, as a 17-year-old, I never imagined that one day I would serve as a chief of staff to a member of Congress. But my experiences, like those of my brothers and sisters in the AAPI community, have not been without its highs and lows. The rise in hate against Asian Americans during the pandemic comes in the context of a broader trend of anti-Asian sentiment around the country. These tragic events reinforce the urgent need to act to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion for the AAPI community. Today, we will have a discussion with the panelists who will share perspectives as Asian American executives, as advocates, and as members of the AAPI community. But first, we are honored to begin our Dialogue for Change with a one-on-one conversation with Congresswoman Judy Chu, who is the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. Congresswoman Chu represents California's 27th Congressional District, which includes Pasadena. She currently serves on the House Ways and Means and Small Business Committees. In 2009, she became the first Chinese American woman elected to Congress in history. She has served as the chair of CAPAC since 2011 and helps lead the Tri-Caucus, a joint effort with the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Congressman Chu, thank you for being here. You have led CAPAC for nearly a decade, serving as a voice and as a policy advocate for the AAPI community across the nation. What does this current moment in time, when violence against Asian Americans is on the rise, mean to you and to the community? And is this bringing long overdue attention to the treatment of AAPIs?
Well, thank you for having me here today, Varun. And let me just start by saying that as chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, it means so much to me that you are having this important dialogue series. For far too long, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, or AAPIs, have been largely invisible in our nation's capital. And as a result, AAPIs have been left out of critical policy conversations and discussions that directly impact our community. But thankfully, that is starting to change. The AAPI community has reached an inflection point due to the hate and violence that we've seen directed at innocent Asian Americans throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. In just the past year alone, over 6,600 incidents of anti-Asian hate were reported. But it wasn't until the shootings at 3 separate Asian-owned spas in Georgia in March that killed 8 people, including 6 Asian women, that our nation finally woke up to the reality that Asian Americans had been facing all this time in this past year. And almost overnight, Americans started to understand the severity of what was happening, especially after they saw video after video of AAPIs, typically elderly people, vulnerable people, being attacked out of the blue with sometimes fatal results. As people started paying more attention, more and more people reached out, asking how they could support the AAPI community. We in the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, in fact, organized a virtual Stop Asian Hate National Day of Action and Healing to bring about even greater awareness. And I was amazed at the response. We had everybody from the president and vice president to celebrities and athletes to grassroots groups and corporations, and a billion interactions online on that day. I was also amazed by the events that were happening in every community across the country, from in-person rallies to virtual conversations to people just posting on social media. It seemed like the whole country was coming together to condemn the bigotry and violence we were facing. And that meant a lot. And it led to two very clear impacts. First, AAPI visibility and solidarity absolutely increased. And we started some incredibly important conversations on race and bigotry. But we still have a long way to go, which is why I'm so proud of the second result. And that is the bipartisan passage of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which is an effort that we in CAPAC spearheaded. Bipartisanship is rare these days, but this bill, which will help us better track and respond to hate crimes, was an important exception. And I'll never forget being at the White House last month when President Biden signed this bill into law. Thanks to the incredible attention that was being paid to AAPIs in ways that had not happened before, we were able to enact legislation that will safeguard Asian Americans, but all Americans, from hate.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for spearheading those efforts. Another question, do you see continuities with the past, and to what extent are recent events different when it comes to anti-AAPI sentiment?
Well, there are a lot of ways that the moment we're experiencing now with the rise in hate crimes are similar to other difficult times for Asian Americans. And the commonality is that Asian Americans have been perceived throughout history as perpetual foreigners, regardless of how long they've lived in the United States. And we've seen how in times of crisis, Asian Americans have been used as scapegoats and faced unspeakable discrimination, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the shameful imprisonment of Japanese Americans during World War II, or the backlash we saw against Muslim, Sikh, and South Asian Americans after the 9/11 attacks. But the closest parallel I can think of is the murder of Vincent Chin. In the 1980s, animosity towards Asian Americans was on the rise as competition from Japan led to the layoffs of American auto workers. This was stoked by leaders and others who blamed Japan for the loss of American jobs. And it all came to a head one night in Michigan when Vincent Chin, who was Chinese American, was out for his bachelor party. He was spotted by two white auto workers who had recently been laid off and wrongly assumed he was Japanese and blamed him for the loss of their jobs. They attacked Vincent with a baseball bat and beat him so badly, smashed his head in, that he died from his injuries a few days later. And instead of celebrating his wedding, his loved ones were forced to plan his funeral instead. Flash forward to where we are today, and we see similarities in how innocent Asian Americans of all backgrounds are being wrongfully stigmatized and blamed for the coronavirus pandemic. But whereas the death of Vincent Chin sparked the creation of so many AAPI advocacy organizations and helped to organize our community, this time we did have organizations like CAPAC ready to respond. And that's led to greater awareness and ultimately a vote on a bill to help protect AAPIs.
Congratulations again on the recent passage of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. It won overwhelming bipartisan support in both chambers. What more can lawmakers and the general public do to eradicate anti-Asian sentiment and violence in America today?
Well, I thank you for that comment, because the passage of the bill was a truly amazing moment, not only because of the big bipartisan margins that made it possible, but because of what came next when President Biden invited me and other AAPI leaders in Congress to stand with him at the White House as he signed it into law. But it's true that this bill is mostly about ensuring that we have a better understanding of how many hate crimes are happening in this country. And it's about enabling local law enforcement to better track and respond to hate crimes. It doesn't address the root causes, which are something that we have to work on. These are harder to legislate because the causes are racism, xenophobic, and dangerous rhetoric. And it's coming to a head, especially around China, especially since we see the rhetoric increasing. And on the China issue, we see that there is a possibility that Asian Americans could be seen as an existential enemy. And that's why last year I sent guidance to every congressional office on how to talk about China without putting lives in danger. To be clear, there are legitimate concerns with China that we must address. And when China threatens our interest, we must push back. But the important thing is that we are specific in our criticisms instead of falling back on dangerous Cold War style rhetoric. Instead of telling the American people that anyone who's ethnically Chinese should be perceived as a national security threat, we must be specific in our criticism of China and make it clear that we are referring to the Chinese Communist Party or Chinese government, rather than indiscriminately targeting all Chinese and Chinese Americans. Relying on the fear of China to sell a policy will only lead to more anti-Asian violence if we're not careful. The other thing that can happen is what happened on the National Day of Action and what is happening here today. And that is conversations that can bring people together. The more we understand each other and reach out to each other, the more we can stand in solidarity against bigotry and hate. And also, let me say that now is the time to really push on institutionalizing ways to teach Americans about the history and the contributions of Asian Americans. This is why we are pushing ahead on an Asian American Smithsonian Museum, why we are so glad to see the formation of the Asian American Foundation, which will fund efforts to have curriculums and teacher training about Asian American history, and why we are so glad at the creation of Launch, which is an Asian form of the Anti-Defamation League, which has spent decades fighting against hate.
Thank you for all your efforts on all of those work streams there. Representation of AAPIs in certain sectors is still lagging, Congresswoman, but there are areas where AAPI representation is significant, such as in mid-level to senior level positions in technology companies. How can our community continue to ensure this robust presence, but also focus a spotlight on having other minority communities better represented, and not just in the technology sector, but across other sectors as well?
Well, it's distressing that although AAPIs are well represented in the tech sector workforce, there are very few AAPIs in corporate leadership. And much of this is due to harmful stereotypes about our community that AAPIs are hard workers, but don't have leadership qualities. In fact, even though AAPIs make up 7% of the total US population, we make up only 2.6% of corporate leadership in Fortune 500 companies. The best way to ensure communities of color are represented in all sectors, including in tech companies, is to be advocates. This is why CAPAC sent letters to the top Fortune 100 companies asking for their diversity numbers in their workforce, their leadership positions, and on their boards. Even though not every company answered back, every company did know that we were watching and holding them accountable, leading us to have subsequent discussions with them on their diversity numbers. But we all must speak up and be proactive when diversity is lacking, whether it's in the halls of Congress, in Hollywood, or the corporate boardrooms where AAPIs are underrepresented. The good thing about the awakening in this country with this whole year of anti-Asian hate is that more companies are embracing efforts to promote greater diversity, equity, and inclusion of AAPIs. As they do that, it's also important that we in the community build a strong pipeline. This has to happen at every level so that there are more people of color positioned to step up when positions become available.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I know we've come to an end of our time with you today, but it was an honor to have you join us. We are grateful for your tireless work and leadership. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Now, I'm pleased to move on to the second part of our Dialogue for Change event, a panel discussion with three distinguished speakers who work every day to make a more just world. Young Kim is co-founder and CEO of Vonolo, an on-demand staffing platform, and co-founder of the Coca-Cola Accelerator. Earlier this year, he made a pledge that workers using the Vonolo app will earn at least the local living wage. And Madeline is the president and CEO of the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies, or APACS, and is a founder and principal of RM Group. She is a nationally recognized civil rights leader and a member of USA Today's inaugural Leaders of Change. John Yang is the president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. He served in the Obama administration as senior advisor for trade and strategic initiatives at the Department of Commerce. In appreciation of their participation, Invariant will be making contributions to their favorite charities. To begin our panel, I'd like to ask each of you to share a reflection on what this moment in time means to you. Are we at an inflection point? Yang, I'll start with you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to share my perspectives. So I grew up in South Korea in the 70s and 80s. And when I was 15 years old, I came to the US by myself on a student visa in the early 90s. I lived in a small town called Oldsboro, New Hampshire. I didn't speak, any English and didn't know anyone. And I rarely saw any other Asian people there. The first 5 years in America were excruciatingly difficult for me. I viewed myself as a foreigner and never felt that I fit in. I experienced a series of racism for the first time in my life, and I lost confidence in myself completely, which was shocking because I grew up as an energetic and confident person in South Korea. Fast forward 30 years, I'm now a naturalized citizen, and America is very much my home, even though my parents, siblings, and relatives are still in South Korea. America is where I met my wife, had my 3 daughters, and found an opportunity to pursue the American dream. And especially in the last 10 years, I've become more comfortable with who I am and gained more confidence in myself, thanks to an incredible amount of support from my wife and those surrounding me that care for me. So when I compare my own experiences as an Asian in the early 90s to what I'm experiencing right now in today's world, I truly believe that we have made some significant progress. And I do believe that we are at an inflection point. And this very opportunity to talk about this important topic is a great example. So I feel very optimistic about the future and for our next generation.
Thank you, Varun. And I am Madeline Milka from APACS. And your question about this inflection point, I come from it from the perspective of representation. So we have the highest number of elected Asian American Pacific Islanders in Congress, and we have 151 state legislators in 31 states, where total number of state legislators are over 7,300. And so there's a lot of work to be done in terms of making sure that we see more representation. The community itself has always been politically active, and it's probably the first time that the mainstream media has actually given us a spotlight to show our historic participation in the civil rights movement and in other aspects of Asian American history. And so a question that I often get when it comes to the things that have happened to the community in light of the anti-Asian hate is there an increased enthusiasm from the community to run for office? And I say that there's a lot of motivation and a lot of participation that has been elevated and has made us more visible. And yet at the same time, the system that is in place that allows Asian Americans and other communities of color to run for office is the same. And those barriers and challenges remain in place. And so the work that we do in terms of this inflection point is really to make it more accessible for all of us, Asian Americans included, to be able to run for office and be more a reflective democracy.
Thank you, Varun, and to Invariant for providing this forum. Yes, we definitely are at an inflection point. I think Representative Chu captured it well in talking about Vincent Chin. I think since no other time since Vincent Chin, almost 40 years ago, has the Asian American community stood up, stood out, and been vocal about our issues as it was back then. But I also want to make sure that we put this in context. Is not only are we at an inflection point within the Asian American community, we're at an inflection point with respect to the discussion of race in America. It should not be lost on us that at the same period of time over the last year and a half where we've had such hatred against the Asian American community, that we've seen the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Daunte Wright, and the list goes on and on. At the same time that we have seen this insurrection at the Capitol at the beginning of this year. So yes, we are at an inflection point, but that inflection point has to be a broader discussion about race, a broader discussion about what it means to be a democracy. So on one hand, I do see the progress that we have made, certainly within the Asian American community, and that there are certain periods where we could see some optimism in the way that corporations are showing up for our community in a way that it hasn't before. But I also don't think that the future is preordained. And this is where all of us need to continue to work together to get to that brighter future that we are hoping for, not only for ourselves, but especially for our children.
Thank you, John. Madeline, there are a lot of stereotypes about the AAPI community. Some of them revolve around us being the model minority. How does that way of thinking lead to bias, discrimination, and inequality for the AAPI community?
You know, the model minority myth also leads to another important issue for the community, and that is data disaggregation. We know that this community is not a monolith. And although there are stereotypes that we're all crazy rich Asians, we know better than that. And we see this when people try to use wedge issues such as affirmative action to drive a wedge between the coalitions that we've built with other communities of color. And so when we see this, we also have to analyze the data that comes with data disaggregation that highlights our underrepresented communities and showcases the fact that, for instance, 1 in 4 Asian Americans in New York lives below the poverty line, which is something that a lot of people don't know, but has historically been told not necessarily in mainstream media. Not having access to healthcare and not having the resources to finish high school. This results in a story that isn't our own, and in an opportunity for us, for our community to really showcase the more vulnerable aspects and hopefully dispel the myth.
Thank you. John, your organization, like Madeline's, focuses on the Asian American community as a whole, yet we're a very diverse group with diverse heritages. How do you reconcile this with some of the stereotypes about Asian Americans?
Right, and I think Madeline touched upon this, is this notion that we are diverse. The fact that we are so diverse, number one, dispels this notion that we are one type of minority, that we are a model minority, or that we are a monolithic group. We need to understand the full richness of our community. Yes, there are Asian Americans that are doing well, but then if we start talking only about them, then we marginalize, literally render invisible the needs of those Asian Americans that are not doing as well. Those Asian Americans that came here as refugees, came here from war-torn countries. Those Asian Americans that have very significant, whether it's language needs, health needs, et cetera, right? So number one is we need to understand all of that. Number two is we think about the damage that this does, again, not only to our own community, but other communities of color. You know, if you go back to this model minority myth, what is this all about? It's about this notion that Asian Americans are a good community of color. They do better than most communities. And then the logical outgrowth of that, for those that believe in this myth, is, well, then this proves that America is not a racist society because there's a community of color that's doing well. Then the next argument that comes from that is, that means that other communities of color are not doing well, not because of racism in America, but somehow it's their own fault, that they have only themselves to blame. We know that that's wrong. And so we have to talk about this myth and dispel this myth, because otherwise, as Madeline says, it drives wedges within all of our communities of color. And the last thing I would say about, sort of as we think about the diversity of our community, is I often think about both the Asian American community specifically, but then America as, I call it a salad bowl. I know some people used to call America a melting pot, this notion that we all come together and assume an American identity, and that American identity is unique, robust, it's a delicious flavor, so to speak. And while all of that might be true, I prefer a salad bowl for one very distinctive reason. And that is that I don't want us to lose our individual identities. I don't think we need to. The fact is we all do come together with our separate identities as a Chinese American, as a Vietnamese American, Korean American, Indian American. I'm making an assumption, sorry, Varun, about your ethnicity.
You're correct.
Together, we have these differences, but then by coming together, we still produce a better dish, something that tastes wonderful together, but we recognize that we haven't lost our own individual identities in that. That's why I think we should talk about diversity in that manner, about how that diversity adds to the strength of our country, adds to the strength of our community, rather than how that might divide us or how that makes things just too complicated to manage. Sorry, Varun, you're on mute.
It had to happen once. Thank you, John, for your interesting views on that. Really appreciate it. Yang, you are a CEO in the tech world. How do you see these stereotypes play out? What do you think your role is as a CEO in confronting bias? And what can other company executives learn from you?
Yes, I did experience these stereotypes personally quite often. Throughout my career, I was passed up for either job or promotion opportunities because I was viewed as the analytical person, not a leader. And some of my performance reviews, my boss would straightforward told me that. They would tell me that he wouldn't see me as someone that can lead the boardroom or had the executive presence. And even when I became a CEO, I had numerous examples where one time, I had a meeting with senior executives of a potential customer in Oklahoma, and when I showed up at the meeting and walked into the boardroom, one of them asked me if my CEO was going to join the meeting. Another time, I went to an investor pitch with my co-founder, who is a Caucasian male, and the investor automatically assumed that my partner was the CEO and I was the engineer or the analyst. So this happens still quite often, whether in the tech world or any other business settings. But when I think about my own experience of how to break down some of the prejudices or biases in the business world, I do believe that it starts from the top. So, one of the things that I made sure that I can lead by example is having the diversity in the boardroom. And we all talk about it. We all talk about increasing the diversity in the board, but it's incredibly hard. So in my example, we have 7 board members. We have 2 African Americans, 2 Asian Americans, 3 out of the 7 members are female. So it's a very diverse board dynamics. But to get there from where we used to be, which was not as diverse, and to get to where we are, it required incredible amount of efforts and making some tough decisions, having tough discussions with the board members on how to make sure that we have diversity at the board. And once you have that, then the next level is having the diverse executive team. And once you have that, the rest of the organization sees that this is what the company represents, and having the diversity at the company is one of the most important things, and it trickles down. So that is what I would say as something that other company executives can learn from, which is it does start from the top, and if you walk the talk and if you lead by examples, then the rest of the organizations follow.
John, how should organizations like Young's be partnering with groups like yours to enact change?
I think that's an interesting question. I think there's a few things that I would suggest. And one would be on the internal side, the other is on the external side. On the internal side, I appreciate what Yang is talking about in terms of ensuring a diverse board, ensuring a diverse staff, and to make sure that you have metrics that you hold yourself accountable to. So in organizations like mine, oftentimes we actually sit on diversity councils for corporations and offer insights based on sort of what we've seen in other industries with other corporations. Also, just having us be able to give them the benefit of our knowledge about training, if you will, about sort of Asian American history, Asian American education, so that that can be instilled into the corporation internally. On the external side, would just be to think about how on the policy issues for any corporation, how that intersects with the policy issues of a community of color, right? If you are a tech company and you are using AI, well, so what are you doing to make sure that AI does not have any sort of bias? How do you make sure that there's no algorithmic bias in what you are doing? If you are a banking and finance company, what are you doing to making sure that those applications, if you're talking about mortgage applications or the like, are getting to as diverse of an audience as possible? Are you making sure that your best products are going to all of the markets, right? And not just selecting markets where it is already predominated by one certain demographic, white male most particularly. And then thinking about sort of what matters to the community, because obviously, for many of the industries, you care about who your customers are, and recognizing that your customer base is exceptionally diverse now and increasingly so by every single year. So making sure that you're intentional about reaching out to those customers, understanding what their concerns are, whether the concerns are related to immigration, voting, other issues that might not be core to your business, but might be affecting how they show up, why they show up, why they choose your product as opposed to someone else's product.
Madeline, you work closely with the Hill and elected leadership. What should corporate leaders know about engaging with policymakers on these issues, and how can they be most useful?
I think a lot of that goes in correlation to John's answer to your previous question, because part of the stakeholders who are a part of public policy making are community leaders. You've got the grass tops, the grassroots, and I think this is a very important issue when it comes to policymakers understanding their constituents and understanding that they have a role in that voice of how public policy is created. And just like what John said earlier about that alignment of values, basically, between what a corporation is doing and what its consumers are also sort of layering on top of what they're purchasing as a part of a brand. They see that as a part of the overall narrative of what that corporation is doing. And so if you look at recent weeks, months, we've seen a lot of states also look at bills that are coming up on voting rights. And you've seen a lot of corporations come out against it because they also view this as civic participation, and that it allows public policy, for them, because they encourage that civic participation from their employee resource groups, from their employees. And so that is also, a correlation between how policy can be made and how they bring forth the fact that if their employees are also constituents to policymakers, that's a pretty strong argument for why corporations can also bring value to the discussion to when you talk to lawmakers.
John, we talked about what more corporations can do. The COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act passed. The White House established its initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. What else should policymakers be doing to ensure that the AAPI community is protected, empowered, and advancing?
There's so many things that can be done. And first and foremost, perhaps, is to continue to speak out about anti-Asian hate. And that sounds small, but it's actually important, because one of the things that the Asian American community most frequently confronts is this notion of invisibility. To have leaders speaking out forcefully against hate, against discrimination is important. In terms of policy issues, I would name a few. Number one would be immigration. It often gets lost in the media and the narrative that Asian Americans make up, a large portion of the immigrants coming to the United States today. Right? We make up actually 40% of all immigrants coming to the United States. And then within that context, recognizing what immigration means to the Asian American community. It's not just about high-tech visas. It's not just about students coming over, but it's also about us being able to reunite with our families. 75% of the family-based visa categories, 75% of Asian American immigration into the United States comes from family-based visa classification. So making sure that that process is robust, recognizing that there's about 1.8 million undocumented Asians in the United States. So that even when you talk about DACA or about Dreamers, there's an element that's Asian American. Then you think about voting, and think about how that impacts us when it comes to voter ID laws or ballot restrictive, restrictions on ballot boxes. Recognizing that many of our communities, it's hard for them to get to the polling place during regular polling hours. And for many of our community, producing an exact match between your driver's license or your social security number is pretty daunting. And then recognizing that we have language difficulties oftentimes. So those are some substantive issues to work on. The last thing I would say is education. When we're talking about hate and racism, where does that come from? Part of it is just a lack of understanding about our history and making sure, as Representative Chu talked about, making sure that we have K through 12 education that includes Asian American history so that we aren't seen as foreigners, but rather we're seen as part of the fabric of America. Those are all substantive issues that I would urge policymakers to get involved in, and would urge all of you, whether from the corporate side or even as the individual side, to give voice to so that policymakers understand the importance of these issues to our communities.
Madeline, would this be an easier hill to climb if Asian Americans were fully represented in Congress? What is the right percentage of AAPI elected leaders?
Well, we're only at 3% in the federal side of representation when we're about 7% of the overall population. So we're definitely underrepresented. So that's also a reflection too of our local elected leaders, as I mentioned, the numbers of state legislators that we have across the country. And the majority of where we have Asian American state legislators is Hawaii. And so, when you think about representation, it's not just at, the state and federal level, it's also, the local level when you think about city council and, county executive, all of those things are extremely important, as is, sitting on a board or a commission. But I would also say during this time period, it was very important to see members of the other caucuses also participate and support the AAPI community in this, because ultimately what we want to see is public policy that benefits all of our communities, all of the underrepresented and marginalized communities that don't, that are not given voice right now at this point. And so, seeing the support from the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, being able to do this in solidarity is really one that, continues to grow in the story of how this country is, made of immigrants, and that, that in itself, it was such a huge amplification for us.
Young, you have used your position as a CEO to advocate for justice for the AAPI community and for all workers. How do you see the role of executives and the role of individuals in enacting change either in the workplace or in the community?
Yes, I do believe that the role that we play is incredibly important. I mean, from a personal perspective, in the last 18 months, when the racial pandemic and issues surrounding this became a lot more exposed to general public, I had my own reservations around whether I should speak up about the topic and whether me having a stance might alienate some of my employees or team members, and whether a business person should ever talk about something like this. I did at the end, and when I did speak up, whether internal formats or external social media channels, I received a lot of feedback from both team members and outsiders saying that they really hoped that I would say something about it, and then they were glad that I said something. And I heard from anonymous people that I had never met, that they felt like they were seen and that they were heard for the first time. And many Asian Americans that reached out to me said that they didn't see that there were a lot of, they didn't even realize that there were actual Asian American business executives out there that were speaking about the issue. So I do think that it's important to come out of your comfort zone and continuously talk about these important issues. And I think that on top of that, it's really important to be consistent about what you're saying, and then putting it into actual actions, and actions speak louder than words. So oftentimes many of these topics get a lot of exposures by the media, and then they kind of fizzle out, and then they quiet down. And I think it's those times that are really, really important. How do you continue staying true to what you said you're going to do when the public attention or exposure is not quite there? I think that's the part that many executives have to really, really focus on, and then turning into actions. And I think that there is a power in, it's quite powerful whenever I see executives being very vulnerable about sharing their deep experiences, personal stories. And I think those stories need to be told as much as possible, whether it's internal, all hands settings with their team members, or externally. I think these stories have a lot of inspirational, motivational elements to it. And the more we hear about these stories, I think the more we can learn from each other. So consistency and being vulnerable, I think those are two things that many of us can continuously practice.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Several of our attendees submitted questions in advance, and others have added questions to our chat box. I'd like to pose one such question to all of our panelists now. In the midst of tensions between US and China, how can we ensure that our citizens and the AAPI community feel safe and not targeted? John?
Sure, let me start. On one level, it's very simple. On another level, it's complex. On the level that's simple is one of the things that we have consistently asked, especially of opinion leaders, and that is whether it's politicians, whether it is media, is to make sure that we make the distinction between the Chinese government and Chinese people, right? To make sure we understand that, yes, we have geopolitical tensions with the Chinese government, but our problems are not with the Chinese people. Our problems are not with Chinese society or Asian society. Even making those statements will help our community to be seen, to help our community understand that we are not scapegoating an entire community, but we are addressing legitimate political issues. And we've actually seen some progress with the Biden administration. The Biden administration certainly has made a 180-degree turn from the previous administration, which obviously demonized our community and didn't care about the scapegoating effect. So that's one place to start. But then also just to be smart in these conversations. Again, that's why education is important, is to make sure that people understand how Asian Americans have been part of our history. The last thing I would suggest is what's called sort of, just training on what we call bystander intervention training, making sure people have the tools if they see an act of hate to respond to it, to protect the victim. And when I say protect, I'm not asking the person to be a superhero, not asking the person to jump into a fight with the aggressor. What I'm asking for is someone just to come in, find a way to de-escalate the situation. At a minimum, after that event happens, go up to the victim and say, hey, are you okay? Can I get you to a place that you're going, right? All of those quote unquote small steps add up to a big difference in how our community sees each other and how our community feels about feeling protected.
Natalie?
I mean, I think John, you put it all together quite nicely. I think what I would first say is, words matter. And so being able to just at the very, basic level, understand the differences and why using those differences make a clear distinction. And so that is, I think, the most basic way to start, making us feel more a part of the conversation without being defensive and without also, feeling like we are being seen as, complicit to, the overall actions to another government's intent. So I would just emphasize that words matter.
Yang, would you like to add anything?
I mean, agree with everything that's been shared. The part that I would add is more around the post. Let's say that there was an unfortunate event happening or happened to you or others around you. I think it's important to speak up after experiencing those. Oftentimes, many people, the victims, they hold it in and they don't even know what to do or how to share that and what outlets. I do think that is, the more you share your stories and the more these kind of stories are out there, I think the level of education will be increased.
Another question that one of our participants asked, and Madeline, I think you brought this up at the onset. How do we convince the data collectors about the value of data disaggregation to better understand the API community?
I mean, I think, from the very onset of, elections, I think about it's so important to poll us, after an election, including us in the things when you list different constituencies to be able to see that Asian Americans are there first, right? Because we're not even counted in those things. And so that's sort of very basic before you even get to data disaggregation. So I just want us to be included, ask us things in general when you're asking other constituencies of our population. And then when you get deeper into the Asian American constituency, then that data disaggregation can start happening. And I think it's important for, we have this now, in the census, but also it's an evolution too, of also understanding, where do we have growing pockets of communities, because when we talk about Pacific Islanders, there are also a lot of other subcategories under that. And so, I don't think a lot of people know that as well. And so I think this is a part of the education of understanding why it's so important to drill down a little bit more for the Asian American community, because then you get such rich data. And if you're a data geek nerd like myself, that's such interesting information. Why wouldn't you want to know more about your consumer, your voters, people who actually live in your districts or any of that type of information? So I just think, the argument for doing the data disaggregation is pretty simple. I mean, we've talked about it a lot. You also hear it now more within the Hispanic community when they talk about, the voting patterns of people in Miami. And so, I think all of us in different constituencies want this data disaggregation because you don't want to put us all under this, umbrella, even though we have this label. So I think the actual case for it is pretty easy. And I think people, as they start to learn more about the nuances of all of our constituencies, will see the value in that as well.
If I could add on to that. Certainly, this is another place where corporations and businesses have a role to play. Because for all of you, if you are to talk to policymakers about how valuable this data is, how valuable this disaggregated data is to your business, and making sure that you're delivering in an efficient, effective manner to your customers, to your consumers, whoever your stakeholders are, that makes a difference. Obviously, coming from a civil rights organization like mine or an organization like Madeline's will have resonance in certain circles. But if we're really to move policymakers about the importance of all of this disaggregated data, we need to go further than that. Last thing I'm just going to say is the person that asked the question is Roland Huang. I'm not sure if that is the Roland from Michigan, but if it is, he's a good friend of mine from a long time ago, so I want to say hello.
Thank you, John. And now for a closing question, and this is for the entire panel. What is your advice to allies? What is the most meaningful way for friends of the AAPI community to show their allyship? I'll start with you, Yang.
I mean, first of all, I want to thank you for even bringing up this important question, and thank you for being the ally, and thank you for seeing and understanding and hearing all these issues. And I think that's the biggest step that I would say. The second part is continue supporting and moving things forward on all the issues surrounding various racial and equality topics, and I think the more we can talk about the issue, and the more we can be vulnerable about the experiences that we have, I think that will help move things forward. So that's what I would say. I don't have any grand vision or any structured answer, but just being part of the movement, I think that just matters a lot.
Yeah, small changes add up to a lot. I agree. John?
Yeah, small changes, the way to think about it, right, is how do you help to take the burden off of the person that you're trying to help? If you're going to be an ally, how are you going to do that? So, for example, one of the things that the Asian American community one of the questions we always get is the "where are you really from?" question, right? As if being from Chicago is not enough. So if I had an ally, white Caucasian male that was standing next to me, when he heard that question, he would say, he's from Chicago, he's a Bulls fan. That would go a long way for me, right? Because it takes a burden off of me to explain myself, explain my identity. Conversely, we as Asian Americans need to do the same thing, so that when our African American colleagues, as an example, get asked the question, why can't you guys just simply say all lives matter instead of focusing on Black Lives Matter? For me to take on the quote unquote burden of explaining to that person why those words have resonance and why we need to focus on why Black Lives Matter. Because part of being an ally is taking the responsibility, taking the burden off of someone else that are being oppressed, always being put upon to sort of explain themselves and explain their identity.
Madeline?
I agree 100% with all the things that Yang and John have already mentioned. I would also include, listen, learn, engage. I think this is, a time for all of us to be vulnerable in the sense that, if I'm sharing my own personal story about something that's happened to me or something that, I want to highlight as a microaggression and to, help educate someone about how to either deal with that or, be able to address it in the future. I hope to learn from others about their experiences, and it just makes all of us together learn how to best engage with one another, and it helps in regards to understanding our history and our personal stories. And I think all of that is about understanding that we all aren't perfect and we all have a lot to learn. And the only way to do that is to engage and to not be fearful of making a mistake. Because I think a lot of people don't want to take that initial step because they're afraid of saying something that would offend or bother, that particular constituency. And so, at the same time, we have to give that person a bit of grace unless they're actually, doing something to really, piss me off, about something that's racist, then that's a different story. But I think if this is about really understanding how we can be better human beings to one another, and sharing how we can just highlight the challenges we've faced and how we can help best bring about, a better society.
Thank you to Congresswoman Chu, Yang, Madeline, and John. Thanks so much for taking the time today to speak with us. And please look forward to follow-up emails from Invariant for more details about the Dialogue for Change speaker series, as well as for additional anti-racism resources. You can also find us on Twitter at Invariant and on LinkedIn. So again, thank you so much to everyone that's participated today.